I've always believed that land has memory, that the soil beneath our feet holds stories far older than our families, older even than the lines that men carve across maps. My ranch was not just a piece of property, it was a living archive of my family's past. My grandfather had bought that land when it was nothing but a stretch of raw wilderness, a wide sweep of plains that bowed into the soft rise of hills, and tucked in between them lay a glittering freshwater lake. As a boy, I had spent endless summers there, fishing off the banks with a rod that was too big for my hands, swimming until my skin puckered, and falling asleep beneath skies so dark that the stars burned with a ferocity city dwellers would never understand. That lake was more than water. It was the heart of my childhood, the pulse of my family's legacy. And when I finally inherited it, decades later, I promised myself that I would protect it with the same reverence my grandfather once had. The lake sat at the far end of the ranch, bordered by a dense line of cottonwoods and pines. It was quiet, undisturbed, except for the occasional deer that would come down to drink at dusk. But over the years, progress crept closer. What was once empty land beyond my fence line slowly turned into subdivisions. And those subdivisions inevitably gave birth to an HOA, one of those homeowner associations that prided themselves on controlling every blade of grass and every mailbox within their reach. At first, I paid them little mind. My land wasn't part of their subdivision, and the lake was clearly within my deeded property. Or so I thought. The first signs of friction came in small ways. A letter tucked into my mailbox saying, "Lake. Access is limited to HOA members only, as if they had the right to dictate who could set foot on my own shore." A couple of cars parked near my fence, with families walking down to the water carrying coolers and umbrellas. I didn't mind at first, telling myself that neighbors deserved a little recreation, but the problem wasn't the families, it was the HOA. They had built a walking path that led directly into my property, a trail that started on their side and ended right at my waterline. At first, I assumed it was an honest mistake, maybe a surveyor's oversight. But then they put up a sign. HOA Private Lake Access. Members only. That was the moment my gut twisted. I knew something wasn't right. Still, I let it slide. The world is full of little injustices, and sometimes the easiest thing is to keep the peace. But one spring weekend, after months of working longer hours than I should have, I decided to retreat to the lake. Not to fight, not to argue, but to find peace in the place where my soul always felt steady. I packed my old canvas tent, my fishing gear, and a cooler, and drove my truck down the gravel path until I reached the familiar clearing where the cottonwoods opened up to the shoreline. The smell of pine mixed with the earthy perfume of damp soil, and for the first time in months I felt like myself again. I pitched the tent, started a fire, and listened to the crackling of the wood as the reflection of flames danced on the surface of the lake. It was perfect, the kind of perfection that city life never lets you hold on to for long. The first night passed without incident. I fished until twilight, ate my dinner by the fire, and fell asleep to the rhythm of frogs and crickets. But the next morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps, not the cautious shuffle of a deer or the crackling of squirrels in the brush, but the firm, deliberate crunch of boots. I opened my tent flap, blinking against the morning light, and found myself staring at three men in matching polo shirts, clipboards in hand, HOA board members. The kind of men who believed authority could be worn like a uniform, even when it wasn't theirs to claim. "Sir," one of them said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you can't camp here. This lake is HOA property." I stood there, barefoot, the cool grass brushing against my toes, and for a moment I was too stunned to reply. "Excuse me?" I finally managed. "This is my land. My family has owned this ranch and this lake for decades. You're the ones trespassing." They exchanged glances, the kind of smug, silent communication that made my blood pressure rise. "We'll give you a warning this time," the tallest one said. "But if you don't pack up, we'll have to call the authorities." I laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. "Authorities? You call the cops on me, and you're going to look pretty damn foolish when I show them my deed." I thought that would be the end of it. Surely no one would be bold enough to summon law enforcement to a man's own property, but I underestimated them. By noon, as I was sitting by the fire frying the morning's catch, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A black and white sheriff's SUV pulled up, lights flashing but siren off. My stomach sank. They had actually done it. They had called the cops on me for camping at my own lake. 2 deputies stepped out, one older, one younger, both wearing mirrored sunglasses that hid their eyes. The older one approached first. "Sir, we've had a complaint from the HOA. They said you're trespassing on private property." I could feel the anger rising in my throat, but I kept my voice steady. "Deputy, this is my ranch. That lake is mine. I can show you the deed, the surveys, everything you need. They're the ones trespassing." Behind the deputies, the HOA men stood with their arms crossed, smirks plastered across their faces. It was clear they thought they had already won. The deputy glanced at them, then back at me. "Do you have the paperwork here?" I hesitated. The deed was locked away at my house, not something I carried when I went fishing. I shook my head. "No, but I can get it. 20 minutes back to the ranch house and I can have it in your hands." The younger deputy shifted uncomfortably, but the older one just sighed. "Look, sir, we're not here to start trouble. But until we can verify ownership, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you don't, we may have to cite you." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. Cited. On my own land. I wanted to scream, to drag those HOA men into the lake by their collars, but instead I packed my gear in silence. The smug looks on their faces as I loaded my truck burned hotter than the sun overhead. They thought they had won. They thought they had power. But as I drove back toward the ranch house, one thing became crystal clear in my mind. They had just started a war they couldn't possibly win. The days after the deputies escorted me from my own lake burned into my mind like a fever I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the humiliation of being told to leave. It was the smug satisfaction on the HOA board members' faces as they watched me drive away. That look had lodged itself inside me like a splinter. It wasn't simply about me camping at the lake anymore. It was about power, about principle. They had crossed a line, not just onto my land, but into my life. And I knew then that ignoring them would only invite worse abuses. The following week, I returned to the lake, not to camp, but to inspect. I wanted to see just how much of my property they had claimed for themselves. What I found made my blood boil. The so-called walking path they had constructed didn't just skirt the edge of my land. It cut right through it like a scar. At the shoreline, they had installed a wooden dock painted in HOA colors and posted a sign that read, "Lake access for HOA members only." Families came and went freely, their kids running barefoot across ground that belonged to me, their parents setting up folding chairs as if it were a community park. And the worst part? Not a single one of them looked at me twice. They had been told this was theirs, and they believed it. The HOA had not only stolen my land, they had rewritten the story of it, erasing my family from the picture entirely. I took photographs, dozens of them, each one sharper than the last. The dock, the signs, the trash bins with HOA logos, even the benches bolted into the soil. When I returned home that evening, I laid them out across my kitchen table like evidence in a courtroom. And that's exactly how I began to see this. Less as a nuisance and more as a case to be built. If the HOA wanted a fight, I would bring them one. But they didn't wait for me to make the first move. 2 days later, I received a letter in the mail. It came in a cream-colored envelope with the HOA's embossed seal in the corner, the kind of overdone stationery that screamed self-importance. Inside was a single-page notice, written in clipped legalese, accusing me of unauthorized camping on HOA property and demanding payment of a fine, what if $500, within 30 days. I read it 3 times, my hands trembling with rage, before crumpling it into a ball and hurling it across the room. They had not only lied to the police, they were now trying to extort me for existing on my own land. That was the moment my anger sharpened into resolve. I drove straight to the county records office, a squat brick building that smelled of dust and stale air conditioning. Behind the counter sat an older woman with horn-rimmed glasses, her hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows. "I need property records," I told her, "for Section 12, Township 7, specifically the parcels around Lake Dutton." She looked at me over her glasses. "That's going to be quite a few files. Are you looking for anything specific?" "Yes," I said. "I want proof of ownership. I want to know where the HOA's land ends and mine begins." She pursed her lips but fetched the boxes. For the next 3 hours, I pored over yellowing maps, surveyor's notes scribbled in pencil, and deeds typed on paper so old the ink had begun to fade. And there it was, clear as day. The lake, shaded in with thick black ink, was entirely within the boundaries of my family's property. No subdivision lines touched it, no HOA covenants extended to it. My grandfather's signature still lingered on the deed like a ghostly fingerprint, a reminder of what was rightfully ours. But what caught my eye most was a later survey, dated just before the subdivision had been built. On it, someone had drawn a dotted line, a proposed walking path that looped down toward the lake. Next to it was a note in red pen: "Access denied, not part of HOA development." Yet somehow, decades later, that dotted line had become a paved reality. They had built their path anyway, ignoring the boundaries entirely. It wasn't just a mistake, it was theft. Armed with documents, I attended the next HOA board meeting. I wasn't a member, but the meetings were technically open to the public. The room was filled with folding chairs and the faint smell of burnt coffee. At the front sat the board, 5 people who clearly thought of themselves as rulers rather than volunteers. When it came time for community comments, I stood. "My name is James," I began, my voice steady though my heart pounded in my chest. "And I own the land you call your lake access. This," I held up the deed, the survey maps, the photographs, all is proof. "You have built docks, trails, and signage on property that does not belong to you. You are trespassing, and you are instructing your members to trespass. If you don't cease immediately, I will take legal action." For a moment, the room was silent. Then the president, a man named Richard with slicked back hair and the kind of smirk you wanted to wipe off with your fist, leaned forward. "Sir, we appreciate your concerns, but according to our records, the lake is part of the community's amenities." I slammed the papers on the table. "Your records are wrong. This is the county's survey. This is the deed signed by my grandfather. The lake is mine, and every day you continue to claim otherwise is another day you're breaking the law." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some homeowners looked shocked. Others looked suspicious, as if they weren't sure who to believe. Richard, however, never lost that infuriating smirk. "We'll have our legal team review this," he said calmly. "Until then, nothing changes." I walked out of that meeting shaking with rage but also with clarity. They weren't going to back down just because I waved a few documents in their faces. They had built their little empire on stolen ground, and they weren't about to give it up without a fight. But what they didn't understand was that I was no ordinary neighbor. I wasn't just a man with land. I was a man with history, with fire in my veins, and with a willingness to go further than they could ever imagine. That night, as I sat at my desk with the map spread out before me, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about the lake anymore. This was about drawing a line in the sand, literally and figuratively. Either I stood up now and defended what was mine, or I would spend the rest of my life being bullied by people who mistook paperwork for power, and I had no intention of being bullied. Not then, not ever again. The days after that board meeting became a study in psychological warfare. The HOA, unwilling to admit defeat, shifted their tactics from direct confrontation to slow, grinding pressure. It started with letters, more fines, each more absurd than the last. One envelope accused me of improper land use. Another threatened litigation if I continued obstructing community access. At first, I laughed at the ridiculousness of it, but the sheer frequency of their harassment wore on me. Every time I opened my mailbox, it was another piece of paper trying to tell me my land wasn't mine. It felt like a constant drumbeat in the background of my life, a reminder that they were watching, waiting, daring me to break. Then came the neighbors. People I had nodded at in passing, people who once waved when they drove by, suddenly began treating me as if I were some sort of villain. One man, red-faced and shaking with anger, shouted at me across the fence line. "Why are you being so selfish? That lake is for all of us." A woman confronted me at the grocery store, wagging a finger in my face as if I were a misbehaving child. "You're ruining this community. My kids love that lake. What's wrong with you?" I wanted to scream back that nothing was wrong with me, that what was wrong was a group of self-appointed bureaucrats who had lied to them for years, feeding them the illusion of entitlement to something that was never theirs. But the human heart doesn't bend easily under facts. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the comfort of believing they belonged to something larger, something exclusive, and I had become the enemy simply for pulling the curtain back. Their harassment escalated. Cars began parking at the edge of my property, headlights flooding my house late at night. One morning I found spray paint on my fence. Community Lake. The words dripped crimson against the weathered boards, and I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't just about legal boundaries anymore. This was about respect, about dignity, about the right of a man to sleep under his own roof without fear of intimidation. So I fought back the only way I knew how, with facts, with evidence, with relentless truth. I spent long evenings at the records office, photocopying every map, every deed, every surveyor's note I could find. I met with an attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Callahan, who had a reputation for dismantling HOAs with surgical precision. She listened patiently as I unloaded my story, tapping her pen against a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled faintly. "Mr. James," she said, "they don't have a leg to stand on. The deed is ironclad. The surveyors marked it years before that subdivision even existed. The lake is yours. The only thing keeping them bold is that you haven't drawn blood yet." "Blood?" I asked. "Metaphorically speaking," she replied. "They thrive on intimidation, on the assumption that no one will fight back. But if you file an injunction, if you start restricting their access, they'll fold quicker than you think." Her confidence steadied me, but it also lit a fire. I realized then that my fight wasn't just about protecting my property, it was about exposing the HOA for what it was, a parasite feeding off the ignorance of its members. They had built their identity around the idea that the lake was theirs, and tearing that illusion away would be like ripping out their spine. So I began to prepare. I installed cameras along the path, capturing footage of every trespasser who stepped onto my land. I posted "No trespassing" signs in bold letters, attaching copies of my deed beneath them. I even printed flyers, yes, actual flyers, and stuffed them into mailboxes around the subdivision, each one containing a scanned copy of the county survey that proved the lake was mine. If the HOA wanted to fight in the shadows, I would drag them into the light. But the more I pushed, the more they retaliated. One evening I returned home to find a notice taped to my door. "Cease and desist. Unauthorized structures on HOA property will be removed." They meant my dock, my grandfather's dock, the wooden planks that had weathered half a century, of summers and winters, The dock where I had learned to fish, where I had once kissed a girl under the stars, where my grandfather had taught me how to tie a proper knot. They dared to call it unauthorized. I tore the notice down and burned it in the fire pit that night, watching the flames devour their arrogance. The tension reached a boiling point one Saturday morning. I drove down to the lake to find a group of HOA board members standing on my shore with a contractor, pointing at the dock and taking measurements. I leapt from my truck, my boots crunching hard against the gravel. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted. Richard, the smirking president, turned to face me. "We're removing unauthorized structures, as per HOA guidelines." I stepped so close I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. "Touch one board of that dock, and I'll have you arrested for destruction of private property." He didn't flinch. He thought his power was greater than mine, that his petty rules outweighed the ink on my deed. But when I pulled out my phone and showed the contractor the county survey, the man hesitated. He looked between Richard and me, uncertainty clouding his face. Finally, he muttered, "Call me when you have this sorted," and walked off. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time. That night, I sat at the lake with a lantern, the water reflecting the glow like molten gold. I thought about my grandfather, about the years he had spent working this land with his bare hands. I thought about the deputies who had once told me to leave, and the neighbors who now looked at me like an intruder. And I thought about the HOA, bloated with arrogance, daring to trespass on something sacred. It was then, under the blanket of stars, that I made myself a promise. I would not rest until every trace of their trespass was erased. The dock, the signs, the path, even their smug assumption of ownership. I would take it all back, piece by piece, until the lake was mine in more than just ink and memory, until it was mine in truth, in practice, in every pair of eyes that looked upon it. And so the battle lines were drawn, not with guns or fists, but with paper, persistence, and a stubbornness they could never match. The HOA thought they had won when they called the cops on me. They thought they had humbled me. What they didn't realize was that they had only awakened something far more dangerous. A man with nothing to lose and everything to reclaim. By the time summer rolled into full bloom, the lake had become less of a refuge and more of a battlefield. Every trip down the gravel path, every glance toward the waterline, carried the weight of conflict. What once sang with the sounds of frogs and crickets was now layered with the bitter taste of tension, and yet I couldn't stay away. This was my land, my family's legacy, and if the HOA thought their endless barrage of threats and harassment would drive me off, they were sorely mistaken. In truth, the more they pushed, the more stubborn I became. The lawsuits arrived first. Thick envelopes stamped with the names of law firms I had never heard of, each one carrying some inflated claim about trespass, interference with community rights, and even defamation of HOA authority. They wanted damages, fines, and in one particularly absurd motion, they demanded a court order to permanently bar me from setting foot near the lake. I sat at my dining room table late into the night, reading through the legal jargon, every page, dripping with arrogance. It was a pile of lies dressed up in expensive stationery. I handed them over to Ms. Callahan, my attorney, and watched her leaf through them with the calm of a surgeon about to perform a routine operation. She smirked at one paragraph, chuckled at another, and finally dropped the stack onto her desk with a thud. "This is nothing but noise," she said. "They're trying to overwhelm you, bury you under paperwork until you fold. But here's the beauty. They don't realize how weak their foundation is. With your deed, the surveys, and the photographic evidence, they're the ones trespassing, not you." Her confidence emboldened me. For the first time since that humiliating day, when deputies told me to leave my own land, I felt the scales tip slightly in my favor. Still, the HOA wasn't going to collapse overnight. They had built their identity on the lie that the lake was theirs, and the deeper I dug, the clearer it became that the lie had been deliberate, not accidental. Through public records requests, I unearthed correspondence between the original developers and the county planning office. One letter in particular stopped me cold. It was a request from the developers asking for permission to include lake access amenities as part of the subdivision's offerings. The county's response was blunt: access denied. Lake and surrounding shoreline are not part of development. Parcel. And yet decades later, here I was, facing off against an HOA that had built an entire mythology around those denied amenities. They hadn't misunderstood. They had chosen to ignore the truth and gamble that no one would challenge them. With Callahan's guidance, I began to strike back. First came the cease and desist letters, each one drafted with legal precision, ordering the HOA to remove their signage, dismantle their dock, and reroute their walking path. Copies were sent to every board member, every contractor, even the sheriff's department. Then came the injunction, filed with the county court, seeking a formal ruling to bar them from setting foot on my land. For the first time, the weight of the law was no longer leaning on their side. It was tilting toward mine. But the real turning point wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the hearts of the homeowners themselves. At first, they had seen me as the villain, the selfish rancher, hoarding what they believed was a shared treasure. But once the cease and desist letters started arriving in their mailboxes, signed not by me, but by a real attorney, doubt began to creep in. I could see it in the way neighbors avoided eye contact when I passed, the way their voices softened when they spoke about the lake. Whispers spread. What if the HOA was lying? What if the lake never belonged to us at all? One afternoon, as I was repairing a section of my fence near the subdivision's edge, a man approached me. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with a weathered face and a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. He introduced himself as Frank, a longtime resident. "I just want to say," he muttered, glancing nervously over his shoulder, "I think you're right. I remember when I bought my house. Sales guy talked about the lake, but when I looked through the paperwork, I never saw anything about ownership. Just access. It never sat right with me." He handed me a folded pamphlet from the subdivision's original sales brochure. Right there, in glossy print, was a photo of the lake, labeled boldly, Community Lake Access. But in the fine print at the bottom, barely visible, it said, "Access not guaranteed, subject to approval." That small shred of truth, buried in the shadows of their marketing, was like a crack in a dam. Once water starts seeping through, it's only a matter of time before the whole thing collapses. The HOA, sensing the ground shifting beneath them, doubled down. They hired private security to patrol the walking path. I watched one evening as a guard in a reflective vest strutted down the trail with a flashlight, barking at kids who strayed too far into the brush. The sight made me laugh. They were pouring money into defending something that was never theirs. To begin with, digging their own financial grave in the process. That was when I made my boldest move yet. I put up a fence. Not a small one, not a token gesture, but a full 6-foot barrier with barbed wire across the top, stretching along the property line where their path spilled into my land. On the gate, I posted a large weatherproof sign, "Private. Property. Trespassers will be prosecuted," and beneath it, laminated for all to see, was a copy of my deed, stamped by the county recorder's office. The uproar was immediate. Homeowners stormed the next board meeting demanding answers. Children cried because their parents told them they couldn't go to the lake anymore. Facebook groups buzzed with outrage and confusion. And for the first time, the anger wasn't directed solely at me. It was turning inward, toward the HOA leadership that had promised them something it never had the right to give. I didn't stop there. I filed police reports documenting every trespass, every act of vandalism, every instance of harassment. I delivered copies of my injunction to the sheriff's office, and the same deputies who once told me to leave began nodding with quiet respect when I showed them the paperwork. It was subtle, but the shift was undeniable. I was no longer the villain in their eyes. I was a man defending his rights. The board, meanwhile, was unraveling. I heard rumors of shouting matches during closed meetings, of members resigning in frustration. Richard, the slick-haired president, tried to project calm in public, but I saw the strain in his eyes when our paths crossed. The smirk that once seemed permanently etched on his face had begun to flicker, replaced by something else: fear. The lake, once stolen from me in spirit, was slowly returning to my hands. Every sign I tore down, every piece of evidence I brought to light, every fence post I drove into the earth was a reclamation, not just of land, but of dignity. And yet, I knew the fight wasn't over. The cracks in their power were widening, yes, but cracks don't bring down a fortress on their own. I needed one final push, one decisive act that would not only reclaim the lake, but shatter the HOA's illusion once and for all. As I stood at the water's edge one evening, the sun setting in a blaze of red and gold, I made myself another promise. When the reckoning came, it wouldn't be quiet. It would be loud, undeniable, and final. The same deputies who once told me to leave would one day serve trespass orders to the HOA itself, and when that day came, I would camp here again, beneath the stars, not as a man in exile, but as the rightful owner. The war was far from over, but for the first time, I knew victory was inevitable. The storm that had been building all summer finally broke in the fall. By then, the HOA was unraveling, its leaders scrambling to hold together the illusion of authority while the cracks in their foundation grew into canyons. The cease and desist, letters, the court filings, the fence I had built, they weren't just paper and wood. They were hammers striking again and again against a hollow shell, and sooner or later, a hollow shell always shatters. The first real blow came from the court. The injunction I had filed months earlier finally reached the judge's desk, and the ruling was clear, sharp, and devastating. The lake and its surrounding shoreline were deeded property belonging solely to me, and the HOA had no right to access, construct, or claim it as a community amenity. The order demanded they remove their signs, dismantle their dock, and reroute their path within 30 days or face fines that would bleed their coffers dry. I remember standing on the courthouse steps, that piece of paper in my hand, my attorney, smiling at my side. For months, the HOA had painted me as a trespasser, a selfish landowner, a villain. But now, in black ink stamped with the county seal, the truth had spoken louder than all their lies. It wasn't just vindication, it was liberation. But the board didn't take defeat gracefully. At the next meeting, Richard, still clinging to his withering authority, stood before the crowd and declared that the ruling was unjust and that the HOA would continue to fight for community rights. I wasn't there, but I heard later that the room erupted into chaos. Homeowners who had once cheered him on now jeered, waving copies of the court order in his face. Some demanded refunds of the lake access fees they had been charged over the years. Others threatened to sue the board personally for misrepresentation. For the first time, Richard's smirk had vanished completely. He was cornered, a king, without a throne, and everyone could see it. I thought perhaps they would retreat quietly, lick their wounds, and disappear. But arrogance rarely surrenders without one final act of desperation. A week after the ruling, I drove down to the lake to find something that made my stomach churn with rage. The dock, my grandfather's dock, the one they had threatened before, was gone. Torn out, ripped from the shoreline, leaving only jagged posts jutting from the water like broken teeth. I stood there in the autumn chill, fists clenched, heart pounding. They had defied the court order. They had defiled something sacred. I called Ms. Callahan immediately, and within hours, contempt motions were filed. But even more satisfying was what happened next. The sheriff's department, the same deputies who had once told me to leave, now drove down that gravel path not to escort me off, but to serve the HOA with citations for trespass and destruction of property. I was there when it happened, leaning against my truck as Richard sputtered and fumed, his face turning the color of spoiled milk. The deputies didn't care about his bluster. They handed him the papers with the same detached professionalism he had once enjoyed at my expense. In that moment, the tables had turned completely. The law was no longer his weapon. It was mine. Word spread quickly through the subdivision. Neighbors who had once screamed at me in grocery store aisles now approached with awkward apologies. Some offered to testify against the HOA. Others whispered their gratitude, admitting they had always suspected something was wrong but had been too afraid to speak up. The Facebook groups that had once vilified me were now filled with residents, demanding Richard's resignation. It was a feeding frenzy, and I didn't even have to lift a finger. They were tearing themselves apart from the inside. But I wasn't content to let the HOA slink away quietly. They had humiliated me, vandalized my property, and tried to rewrite history. Justice demanded more than survival. It demanded reckoning. So I pushed the county to enforce every aspect of the ruling. Crews arrived within weeks to tear down the illegal path, ripping up the asphalt and returning the land to soil. The signs were removed, the benches hauled away, the trash cans carted off like evidence of a failed empire. One by one, every trace of their trespass vanished, leaving the lake as it had always been, wild, untamed, and mine. Richard tried to rally one last time, filing an appeal, but by then his board had fractured beyond repair. Members resigned en masse, unwilling to throw more money into a fight they couldn't win. The HOA's coffers, drained by legal fees and fines, ran dry. And in a final twist of irony, homeowners voted to dissolve the association entirely. The monster that had called the cops on me, that had tried to erase my family's legacy, had destroyed itself from within. The day after the final ruling came down, I packed my old canvas tent, loaded my cooler, and drove down that familiar gravel path. The air was crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the lake shimmered beneath the setting sun like a mirror of fire. I pitched my tent on the same clearing where months earlier I'd been forced to leave under flashing lights. I built a fire, its crackle blending with the whispers of the cottonwoods, and I cast my fishing line into the water just as I had as a boy. As the stars came out one by one, I leaned back against the cool earth and let the peace wash over me. No board members, no security guards, no deputies with mirrored sunglasses, just me, the lake, and the memory of my grandfather smiling somewhere in the darkness. They had called the cops on me once. They had tried to take what was never theirs. But in the end, the truth had drowned their lies, and I had reclaimed not just the land, but the soul of it. And in that moment, beneath the infinite sky, I understood something deeper. Land may be bought and sold, claimed and disputed, but belonging is something else entirely. This lake had always belonged to me, not because of ink on paper, but because of every memory, every heartbeat, every night spent beneath these stars. And now, finally, no one could ever take it away again.